And thanks so much for joining us on Morning Live. Now, we are going to do that interview with Professor Mary Metcalfe. Now, the Basic Education Department, of course, proposing the phased reopening of schools. And briefing Parliament's committees yesterday, the department's Director General Mathanzima Mweli said that the plan was for grades 7 and 12 to go back to school next Wednesday. And that would mean that teachers would have to go back to school as early as Monday, with learners returning then from the 6th of May. And there's been much outcry, with parents saying that they will not send their children to school without there being adequate protection from COVID-19. So will this phase plan actually work, and can the school year still be salvaged? Joining us now via Skype is education expert Professor Mary Metcalfe, who is also a senior research associate at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Metcalfe, thanks so much for your time this morning. Welcome to Morning Live. Professor, first off, before we address the basic education plan, let's just begin with some real concerns that parents have expressed. They are incredibly worried about schools being clean, amongst other basic sanitary matters. What do you think the Department of Basic Education needs to do to allay the fears of parents with regard to this first and foremost?
Sakina, I think are anxious. And I think the minister is going to be against.
Professor, unfortunately, the sound cutting out there, so we cannot hear what Professor Mary Metcalfe is saying. We're going to try and resolve that particular matter, and then we'll come back to this. So we are talking to education expert Professor Mary Metcalfe, of course, after yesterday's parliamentary briefing by the Director General in the Department of Basic Education about how exactly the department plans to return learners to school, talking about a phased-in approach starting with grade 7 and grade 12. Let's see if Professor Metcalfe has a better connection to us now. Professor, let's just try that again, allaying the fears of parents at this stage.
Thank you, Sakina. I hope you can hear me now. Allaying the fears of parents is central at this point, because the public has to have confidence in the steps that government is taking. When one looks at the presentation made by the DG of the DBE to Parliament yesterday, there's been, I think, so much information, and we've missed one important thing he said. He said that there's non-negotiables. There's non-negotiable preconditions for the reopening of schools. And I think if parents and teachers and learners understand that he has said unequivocally non-negotiable preconditions includes having the essentials of basic sanitation and hygiene practices, having water in all schools, having cleaners in all schools, having screeners in all schools, having additional teaching posts, and having additional classrooms to cope with the overcrowding required by social distancing. I think that we need now to talk to the Department of Basic Education as the public and the stakeholders to say, give us progress that you are monitoring these preconditions in all 9 provinces. Now, that should allay parents' anxieties. We should not be seeing the return next week as being independent of meeting those preconditions. So what does that mean to me? It means to me that I think, given the reaction of the unions, given the reaction of many parents, it may be that the department needs more time to put these preconditions in place. But I'm happy that they're saying these are non-negotiables.
Professor, your initial thoughts regarding a phased-in approach to restarting the academic year. What are your thoughts on that? Grade 12, I think most people would agree with, but explain to us grade 7 and the need for them to then go back along with the grade 12s as per the proposal.
A phased approach is critical because there's so much we need to learn about how the opening of schools is going to impact on community infection. It's also essential because if we're going to abide by the national guidelines for the lockdown level 4, we're supposed to be keeping a 2-meter distance between individuals. It's impossible to do that under normal schooling conditions. When the grade 12s come back, which I suspect may not be next week, but let's wait and see what the minister says, a normal grade 12 class will have to be distributed across several classes in order to accommodate all of the learners. Now, that has immediate implications for who's going to teach these different classes. How are we going to manage a timetable that allows this? We could not do that if all of the grades came back at the same time. So the first, when the schools are ready, meet the preconditions, when grade 12s come back, let's monitor the effect on community infection, and let's also make sure that we learn how to manage schools under this context. Sakina, we live in uncertain times. I know that parents want certainty. They are both concerned about their children, and at the same time, I want them to go back to school. We need to know that we have to follow the best science. We have to follow the best advice. We have to take all stakeholders with us, because it's paramount importance that the public has confidence when their children do go back to school.
And Professor, what about the grade 7s? Why is it important for them also to return at the initial stage alongside the grade 12s?
Thank you. I think with the grade 7s, my understanding of why I would argue for the grade 7s to come back at some point is because we need to get the primary schools also functioning institutionally to be ready for a gradual rollout. So if we only start with the grade 12s, and we may start with the grade 12s and then bring grades 7s in later, the minister will determine that. As soon as the grade 7s are in school, then the primary school can start setting up the routines and the new institutional practices for COVID. I am worried about the long delay that's proposed before we get our foundation phase learners back. By the time, on the proposed timeline, by the time foundation phase come back, they will have forgotten much of what they've learned. But I think with all of these proposed times, they're going to be subject to our learning about the virus. And I think we need to stop thinking these are the terms, there's going to be this term, it's going to end. We need to be able to be vigilant to monitor what's happening in the readiness of the education department, monitoring what's happening in terms of the opening of schools and community infection. And we need to maximize the learning of our children at home through whatever measures we can during the time that they're not at school.
And the difficulty with your last point, Professor Metcalfe, is, of course, the massive inequality that exists in our countries, not just when it comes to school infrastructure, but we even know if we take that situation within the home, we are all at different levels. So some parents may be illiterate themselves. Some children come from child-headed households. Some may have access to online learning and teaching materials. Others may not. So again, what does this mean for the rest of the academic year? Because it obviously is going to mean that some people are going to be at different levels than others.
Yeah, the virus just shines a light on all of our inequalities. It shines a light on all of the problems that we haven't been able to address until now. The inequalities in access to resources to learn at home is striking. I was very pleased when I heard the minister say in an interview the average family doesn't have access to the internet, the data, the devices. Now that means that we have to use learning media for distance learning that most families can access. Most families can access radio, most families can access television, but families and parents need support to understand how to integrate that into a structured day for their child. I know different groupings, the Civil Society Coalition is preparing a guideline for parents to support their learners at home. I'm hoping that that will be translated into all of our South African languages and distributed widely. But learners will need their textbooks and workbooks at home. Parents will need the schedule. Parents will need to have confidence in knowing how to structure the day, that there's times for working, They need the radio and television broadcasts for that. There's times for chores, there's times for play, there's time for rest. But the notion of a structured day that maximizes learning will help us contribute to the continuity of learning. But these are not normal times, and we can't expect that we're going to be certain of the decisions that lie ahead, and we can't be certain that we're going to cover all of the curriculum content that we had hoped in January or February.
Now, with all of that in mind, Professor Metcalfe, the question then arises, can we salvage this academic year? And if so, to what extent? Because you look at all the pedagogical issues, you look at the philosophical and ideological issues behind this, the way learners learn, the way teachers teach, and some learners are going to struggle with what is being proposed already.
Yes, it's going to be difficult. I think we should drop this concept of losing the school year, because I think that gives a message that there's not going to be learning. We've got to say that our first principle is that we're going to maximize this learning for all children, and we're going to find distance learning methodologies that support them. That has to be our priority, because the trajectory of the epidemic is still unknown, and there may be further spikes and further lockdowns that may be geographic. The second thing we've got to say is that children have not had the time this year to learn everything that they should. But we need to understand that they can catch up this content over the next 18 months. It doesn't have to be crammed into 1 year. The group that is most at risk in terms of the year are the grade 12s. I know the minister and all of the provincial departments are so committed to ensuring that the grade 12 class can write. And I think that we need to support them. We need to find the strategies. We need to find ways of coming together as communities in terms of churches making buildings available. We need to support our grade 12s. For the other grades, we maximize the learning of what they should have covered in this school year, and we understand that this school year, next school year, will be collectively a catch-up exercise during the period of this virus, which is going to be to 2 to 3 years. So it requires consultation, it requires careful thinking, it requires monitoring the evidence, and it requires that we are flexible and understand that certainty and clear answers are our enemy at the moment, because they limit our openness to understanding new problems and challenges.
Professor Metcalfe, it is 7 o'clock already. If you don't have anything else to go do, can I please ask you to please stay on the line with us so we can continue this after the news?
I'll stay online, Sakina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Professor Mary Metcalfe, education expert, speaking to us about yesterday's briefing to Parliament by the Department of Basic Education. So we'll continue with this interview after news, but at 7 o'clock.